At this point, one would think that Ishmael is the promise of God. He is Abraham's firstborn son. And God said that he would be the father of great nations. Because usually a son, especially a firstborn son, is automatically the builder of a family's name and carries on a family's line. In this case, it was not so. As the story continues, I look further into the meaning and representation of Hagar and Ishmael and Sarah and Isaac to find out why. Why was God's promise through Sarah and not through Hagar? God is extremely strategic and detailed in his planning. In that time, two-tiered marriages were a common practice. For Hagar and Ishmael, the child or children of a concubine, a low status or secondary wife, were not entitled to an inheritance, as stated in Genesis 25:6. Also, as I look further into the meaning of Hagar's name, it means stranger, one who fears. Ishmael means hear from God, or God hears, excuse me. So yes, God does hear a stranger, as recorded in Genesis 21:17. So I looked up the word stranger. Stranger, a person or thing that is unknown or with whom one is unacquainted. One ignorant or unacquainted with someone or something. Stranger. We were all strangers until we said yes to Christ. Until we actually gave our life to Christ and got into a relationship with God, we were all strangers. So God did hear Hagar and Ishmael. He provided their needs and issued out a blessing. Also, God does hear a cry that no one else does. And he moves on our behalf. I wrote it, physically wrote this because I'm old school.
Amen.
Come on, lady Tori. Come on.
It's personal. I want to be personal. This is a monumental moment for me. It's personal. Got writer's cramp. Hagar's primary representation is slavery. Ishmael was born according to out of flesh. Hagar's giving birth to Ishmael is done according to flesh. Galatians 4:23. Abraham and Hagar tried to get God's promised blessing by their own strength without relying on God's supernatural enablement. They depended on their own resources. They wanted God's blessing, but not on God's term.
Yeah.
Amen.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Amen.
Just me?
No, you.
I know. They depended on their own resources. Anything birthed out of flesh is not received and is weakened. God rejects what comes from out of our flesh. Ishmael was not accepted as an heir because he was no better than his mother, a slave. Slavery, flesh, disobedience are all strangers to God. Being a slave, you are a person held in servitude as a chattel or an immovable property of another. Servitude has you lacking liberty to determine your course of action or way of life. Being immovable or unable to make a choice about your way of life doesn't line up with the walking in the promises of God. When we act out of flesh, the Tori way. When we act out of flesh without trusting God for his gracious enablement, it's disobedience and excludes us from our inheritance. Ishmael is also a product of self-reliance. Abraham ceased to rely on God's power to fulfill his word and instead of rely on his own power and ingenuity to get a son. Now Sarah Sarah represented freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Initially spelled Sarai, meaning princess. Her name was intentionally changed by God to Sarah, meaning captain, chieftainess, commander, queen, to be a sign of his promise under his inspiration in association with a particular promise or covenant. Sarah is associated with the covenant of grace into which her son Isaac enters. Abraham and Sarah were well beyond childbearing years. God's intention was to give Abraham and Sarah a son and an heir when it looked humanly impossible, so that they would have to rely solely on God.